On a recent episode of The Dividing Line, Dr. James White took an opportunity to address a brief video by Dan McClellan on the subject of monotheism in the Bible. In the video, McClellan points out that scholars have noted two things in the biblical text that appear to cause one to question whether or not the biblical text is monotheistic or not. The first point that McClellan raises is that the authors of the biblical text are clearly comfortable with not merely mentioning the existence of other gods and have no apparent difficulty identifying them as such. His second point goes right to the definition of monotheism, tracing its historical origins and the fact that it is not about the particular insistence on the existence of a single God, but more of a statement of one's identity in association to a particular God. White offers what I would call a canned fundamentalist response to McClellan, but there are some problems with his interaction that I think should be addressed. And that's what we're going to be doing on this episode of the BLOGCAST, so hang in there while the title card rolls. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. I, of course, am Triggerman1976, and welcome back to the BLOGCAST. As noted in the introduction, we're going to be looking at a recent response by Dr. James White of Alpha and Omega Ministries in response to a video by Dan McClellan on the subject of whether or not the Bible is monotheistic. But before we do that, I want to be sure and say thank you for watching the video. If this is your first time on the channel, please give this video a like. If you're a returning viewer and aren't already subscribed, then please be sure to hit that subscribe button and don't forget to ring that notification bell so you'll know when new content is available. Also, if you're watching this on YouTube and are concerned about YouTube's censorious tendencies, then head down into that description box and click on my link tree, and you'll find a link to my Rumble channel where I also post the BLOGCAST. While in the link tree, you'll also find links to my social media where you can follow me on X and Instagram at Triggerman1976. You'll also find links to my blogs and my affiliate store where you can find many of the great resources that I use. Purchases from the store help me to produce content and help you with great deals. That being said, let's get into the videos. One thing that I've consistently pointed out in these discussions is that the biblical texts are not merely historical texts, but they also have a history. More importantly, one of the great errors of those who consider themselves to be the greatest defenders of the historic doctrines of God, as well as the authority and clarity of Scripture, is to forget that the biblical text has a human element. The texts were written by men in various circumstances and in different periods. Those who affirm the inspiration of Scripture, thereby establishing its ontological nature as a product of God's activity, often find themselves at a loss when dealing with the text in terms of its place in history, seeming to forget that the text had to be written. But there is also a reluctance on their part to be willing to consider that part of the process of inspiration including the experience of the authors, including their literary influences, which made their writings comprehensible to their original audiences. After all, the God who knows every word we speak before we speak it is capable of superintending the divine process so that what is spoken is done willingly on the part of the speaker, and yet the result is exactly as God decreed it. The obvious and rather logical implication of inspiration is that the totality of the content, including its historical and cultural context. This leads us to what is known as interpretation, specifically the science of biblical exegesis. The Apostle Peter, writing in his second epistle, makes an observation about unbelievers in general and naive, unstable, and uninformed believers that, if taken to heart, explains so many of the problems that people have with understanding and accepting the Scriptures. The point he makes is that the Scriptures can often contain things which are hard to understand, or perhaps even accept. And because of that, they will twist them either out of their own ignorance or instability to destructive ends. To that, I am more than happy to add that one of the conceded points about Scripture can similarly take those elements which are consistent across all human-produced materials, and inconsistently use them to dismiss the Scriptures or concepts that the writers themselves or their audiences might have had or necessarily appealed to, which are things that we need to keep in mind in order to understand the text, and more importantly, make correct application of the text, as Gordon Fee points out. The first task of the interpreter is called exegesis. This involves the careful, systematic study of Scripture to discover the original intended meaning. This is primarily a historical task. It is the attempt to hear the word as the original recipients were to have heard it, to find out what was the original intent of the words of the Bible. This original meaning and original intent needs to be understood before we can begin to draw any meaningful conclusions from the text. Else we run into misunderstanding the text, and in misunderstanding it, we misapply it. Points which I am certain that both Doctors White and McClellan would agree with. The reason that I say this is because the opposition to the faith likes to use what are relevant considerations necessary to properly interpret the text, just to undermine it. The believer should be able to use the same considerations to demonstrate that the text is communicating both in terms of accurate history, but also in terms of eternal truth, either about man or God. Right at the beginning of his video, McClellan points out that the
Bible acknowledges the existence of other gods from beginning to end. They are repeatedly recognized as deities in the Hebrew Bible, in Greco-Roman period Jewish literature, in the New Testament, in early Christian literature.
Later in the video, he defines monotheism in terms of identity and adds that the modern conception of it holds
that all other existence is subordinate to and contingent upon God. In other words, it requires the doctrine of creation ex nihilo.
Now, I find nothing necessarily disagreeable about these points from a scholarly perspective. McClellan's concern seems to be that people are attempting to redefine monotheism in an attempt to find it in the Bible, but he's already pointed out a problem that he needs to account for: a coherent definition of monotheism. So that means before one can be accused of redefining, one needs to provide a meaningful definition, like what is found in John Anthony Dunn's article in the Lexham Bible Dictionary, which defines the term monotheism as the belief in only one God. We should note that monotheism needs to be distinguished from other positions, such as monolatry, the worship of one God without exclusion of the belief that others may exist. Monotheism, worship of one God while recognizing the existence of others. Polytheism, worship of and belief in multiple gods. And pantheism, the belief that God is everything and everything is God. So when it comes to defining monotheism, as Dunn puts it, it's the assertion that there is only one divine nature or essence. Nothing else exists that is like God or comparable to God. The doctrine of monotheism is therefore intrinsically concerned with the otherness of God. A central aspect of monotheism is the belief that all existence is dependent on God and owes existence to Him. This is a key contention for Dr. White's argument, and it's a point that he articulates in his book, The Forgotten Trinity. Monotheism, one God, Yahweh, no other gods besides me. These are basic and fundamental truths. It was truly novel in the days when polytheism reigned supreme as the religious consensus of the world, for anyone to claim that their God was the creator of all things. But God would not allow his worship to be polluted by the false idea that he was but one God among many true deities. While this is a central contention for Dr. White's response to Dr. McClellan, it essentially bypasses the latter's own key contention and runs straight into the problem of language that even affects those who are skilled in the original languages and results in the importation of ideas into the text. One can have a dictionary knowledge of the language, but even as English speakers recognize, a dictionary only gives us so much of the meaning of a word, not merely in its immediate use, but in historical use. More importantly, words can drop out of use or be replaced by others. But it's not simply language, in this case translation, that is at issue, but also what words meant in their original context, which includes matters of geography, topology, politics, setting, occasion, and matters of genre, can all influence how one understands the text that they are reading. When it comes to actually dealing with the text itself, it can never mean anything other than what it meant to its original audience. To that end, we need to be careful not to read later assumptions, whether correct or not, backwards into the biblical text. Instead, we need to develop them from the text. All right. In responding to McClellan's claim that the Bible is not monotheistic, White decides to begin his defense from the text of Jeremiah 10. While this text might provide the basis for some key theological truths, I believe that White falls directly into a trap that McClellan has set for anyone attempting to respond to him without actually addressing his claim. However, White is correct when he points out that Jeremiah 10 is a letter of admonition to exiles from Judea and Babylon. This appeal is fine and good, but it fails to start where one should begin, with the foundation of Israelite theology that is essentially laid out in the book of Deuteronomy. While Dr. White mentions an appeal by LDS and liberal theologians, McClellan himself is a Mormon, to Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9's apparent distinction between the Most High, or the Almighty, El Elyon, and Yahweh, it needs to be asked that if such a distinction can be made and maintained, then one must explain why Yahweh identifies himself as the Almighty in passages such as Exodus 6:3, or is identified as the Most High in Genesis 14:22. Clearly, there's an intentional blurring of the two that needs explanation. More importantly, there's a clear recognition that Yahweh is counted as one among many, Psalm 138:1, yet is distinct, superior, and brings judgment upon those same gods. Exodus 12:12, 15:11, 18:11, Psalm 82. What is relevant to the discussion here in regard to Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9 is a textual variant that Dr. White mentions but doesn't really elaborate on. So, what is the variant in question? Most English translations follow the King James, which is based upon the Masoretic text of Blomberg's 1547 Rabbinic Bible, with some harmonization to certain New Testament readings. Now, this is not to say the King James is an inferior translation. In fact, it has been praised for its accuracy in rendering the Hebrew. The problem is that, as Dr. White says,
Dan Barker throwing it out. I'm like, wow, heard this before. And it's actually based on a textual variant. And so I was able to look it up. I had stuffed that Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia into the bag. And so I was able to look it up while Bill was talking on the air. My eyes were still good enough back then to read that small print Hebrew. And I found the variant. And I was able to respond to his use of the text and his use of the variant because I had my Hebrew text with me. That's one of the illustrations that I used when the next year, I believe, I taught Hebrew for Golden Gate. And that was one of the illustrations I used. Why should you bother to learn this language? Well, here's one example where it came in handy.
Says, there's a textual variant, and a few newer English translations have picked it and placed it into the running text rather than referencing it in a footnote, such as the English Standard Version, which reads here, "When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people according to the numbers of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage." The distinction in readings between the King James Version's Sons of Israel and the ESV's Sons of God has created some questions and concerns for Christians and appears to give credence to McClellan's claim. On the substance of the variation in regards to its authenticity, Jewish scholar Nahum Sarna notes that the reading Sons of Israel poses some interpretational problems that creates anachronisms in relation to other texts and makes the reading essentially nonsensical, with reading Sons of God, which is evidenced in the Septuagint and some Qumran sources, lends credibility to it likely being the original reading and thereby makes interpretation easier and grants consistency with similar readings found elsewhere in the Hebrew Scriptures. What makes establishing the originality of this reading so theologically significant to the discussion? Well, for some, it helps them to establish their belief in a pantheon of gods, which is important given their theological conclusions, which I'm not going to elaborate on here. But also, just for the discussion here, At least it provides for McClellan, in theory, a potential basis for his claim that monotheism is not a central claim of the Bible. Even though he does not mention this passage in his video, White does. His mention involves responding to a Mormon theologian on a radio program some time ago, as well as the fact that he gets mentioned by Dan Barker in a recent debate. And he remarks that the argument is usually presented by Mormon readings that El Elyon has divided the earth and given Israel to a lesser god named Yahweh or Jehovah. Scholars have pointed out that there's a blurring that occurs in the text between the different names of Yahweh, and yet at the same time, the biblical authors clearly make distinctions between the two. We can even find instances in Scripture where more than one figure, each identified as Yahweh, the Lord, appears in the same scene, such as Genesis 19:24 and Exodus 34:5 and 6. This blurry presentation of God penetrates into the Second Temple period and raises a number of questions from thoughtful interpreters about how to understand the second in reference to the first. When reading the Old Testament against the cultural backdrop of the ancient world, one cannot help but see similarities, even if they're just superficial, in how God is presented. As Peter Schaeffer has noted, Bible scholars today paint a multifaceted picture of the idea of God in ancient Israel, in which various gods stand side by side and compete with one another. Israel's own God, Yahweh, has to assert himself not only against numerous powerful spirits and demons, but especially against the deities of the Ugaritic and Canaanite pantheon, headed by the old god El and his subordinate, the young war god Baal. Well, what's important about this is that we never seem to ask what was so alluring about idol worship and why Israel always, at least up until the Second Temple period, seems to devolve into it, and why, more importantly, portrayals of Yahweh often borrow and depend heavily upon the imagery common to these other religions. For example, one of the most significant texts used by Christians and even Christ himself to identify himself, Daniel 7, borrows heavily from the Baal cycle. Now, there are a few ways that interpreters of various stripes have dealt with this borrowing, varying from straight up accusations of plagiarism to simple repurposing of commonly available literary images. But the fact is, there is overlap, and this has to be recognized and addressed coherently. However, Dr. White appears reluctant to accept this and rejects it out of hand. Now, while I don't want to attempt to engage in any mind reading, it seems as if he's afraid that accepting it automatically provides ground for undermining his contentions. I believe that the opposite is the case. The refusal to either acknowledge or interact with these realities often appears to do more damage than they help, much like ignoring a persistent, painful limp can eventually end in the loss of a limb. Now, I believe Dr. White is absolutely correct about how the Babylonians are arguing toward the Israelites when he says that they are
making claims to them about their gods. Hey, our gods defeated your gods, so why don't you listen to us?
Now, we have to deal with how powerful this argument would be in the context of the ancient world, especially since the survival of a nation, the people with a distinct identifiable group, was dependent largely upon their identification of and with their patron god. So when we encounter these arguments, then we should be comfortable with the proposition, especially when it intersects with concepts that are nascent in Scripture itself. For example, Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9. However, we often fail to read the biblical text within these particular cultural understandings, much less within the context of their own contemporaries. There is overlap between Jeremiah and Ezekiel that requires us to look at them together, especially since Ezekiel's commissioning as a prophet seems to parallel what Jeremiah is writing, as well as dealing with the problem faced by Israel, a temptation to turn from Yahweh. See Ezekiel chapter 2. One of McClellan's key contentions is the biblical statements of I am and there is no other Or
say things like, I am and there is no other. There is none like me. This is the rhetoric of incomparability, and we find...
Okay.
this rhetorical overlap means what exactly? That the biblical authors didn't live under a rock, that they spoke in terms that non-Israelites could understand? Exactly what is the harm in recognizing that fact? Dr. White never explains that. One of the most important aspects of idolatry that one needs to remember, at least understand, is that there was, and we might say should be, an understanding that the idol was simultaneously both the god and not the god. An idol, a stela, or a temple was understood to be a place where a god could reside and manifest itself. This is an understanding we see reflected even in Israelite religion. For example, in Psalm 48:9, the psalmist writes, "We have thought on your steadfast love of God in the midst of your temple." Psalm 27:4, we have a similar expression. "One thing I've asked of the Lord, that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple." The temple is considered to be the location of Yahweh's presence and is central to Yahweh's ability and willingness to manifest, something that's seen in both the appearances at the tabernacle in the wilderness and at the dedication of the temple by Solomon. So while a temple was central to the community and an idol, as the representative image, was central to temple worship, it served as only an interface. So when Jeremiah speaks of the construction of the idol, he's denigrating the fact that the God behind the image has no ability to manifest itself outside of the object. Everything the prophet says about the object, especially when it's compared to a scarecrow in Jeremiah 10, verse 5, is intended to demonstrate the emptiness of the object, not deny the existence of the spiritual entity behind the object that allows one to interact with. Yahweh, in contrast, has regularly demonstrated not only the ability to manifest apart from an idol or temple, but also in spite of them. I noted earlier that McClellan sets up some traps in his arguments that if one isn't careful, they can fall into. One of the traps has to do with the association of monotheism and a belief in creation ex nihilo. Not to spend too much time on this, but it suffices to say that if your confidence in the biblical narrative of creation is dependent on a completely reconcilable one-to-one correspondence between a scientific accounting for nature and revelation, then you should perhaps lower your standards. From a philosophical perspective, there is an inherent recognition that there are certain things which can never be accounted for scientifically. In some way, ultimately, there are some things where the relationship between elements just breaks down, and the science cannot get behind them or provide a coherent accounting for them. They must be taken on faith. Scientific laws explain that relationships exist, but they do not explain why those relationships are the way they are. They can explain how something works now, but they can't explain why the thing works the way it does, or if it will continue to do so. Honest approaches to the study recognize these gaps and might even acquire an accusation of God of the gaps reasoning. So be it. It doesn't change the facts, and for the Christian, our God is the God of the facts. Everything and anything that exists because of God, and nothing exists apart from him. Colossians 1:15-17. This same realization accompanies our interaction with the text of Scripture, especially when we impose certain assumptions on it. For example, Genesis 1:2 speaks of waters that the Spirit of God is hovering over. Two things are presented in contrast to one another: water and spirit. Where else have I seen that? Never mind. Now, those who take position of creation ex nihilo appear to have a question they need to answer. Where did the water come from? And this is an important question because it doesn't say the water was created. It's important due to the fact that if you're going to argue that the creation account of Genesis 1 is describing something that actually happened as a matter of fact, instead of as a conceptual guide, you have a problem because the text doesn't ever say that the water was created. And it's from the water that the structure of the world begins to arise. And the last time I checked, water wasn't nothing. What we do see in Genesis 1's account of creation is God existing in contrast to something else. Something Dr. White points out, but something that he misses, I believe, is that the biblical authors were not concerned with the question of where matter ultimately came from. Their appeal to God as creator was designed to enhance his sovereignty, not explain the origin of the universe. As much agreement as I might have with Dr. White when it comes to his response, it gets seriously undermined when he mentions the late Dr. Michael Heiser.
They're idols. They don't have real existence. Well, but then the Greco-Roman period. Oh, you're talking about the intertestamental stuff, about the unseen realm stuff that Heiser was all big into and all that. Is that what you're talking about? Probably. I'd assume so. But his stuff never stood up to examination against the entire canon of Scripture either.
Perhaps Dr. White should have used that little platform called Google, because if he had, he would have seen that Dr. Heiser had already responded to Dan McClellan on this very topic 15 years ago and demonstrated that many of McClellan's conclusions were, well, nonsense. The difference between White's approach as an apologist and Heiser's as an academic is that White goes for the theology and Heiser goes for the conclusions based on the evidence presented and argued, which is why Heiser does sometimes sound more accommodating and agreeable, which is why Heiser can say in response to McClellan that you just can't prove a neat evolution from polytheism to monotheism when there's a terminological confusion and so much polytheistic material in later Jewish periods. The solution is not to bend the data to the prevailing paradigm. It's to fix the paradigm. Throughout this analysis, I have attempted to point out that Dr. White, as helpful as he has been in demythologizing scholarship and matters of textual critical research and exegesis, simply walked into our right. It's not that he's necessarily wrong or McClellan is correct. It's that White has oversimplified the picture, and at the same time, I recognize I could simply be engaging in a nitpicking exercise. Dr. White wants to hold on to a position that is a piece of deep Christian tradition that perhaps the biblical text doesn't support, creation ex nihilo. The fact is that many of his conclusions run afoul of the data. Christianity is a data-driven religion, and the Bible is our source of data. The problem we face is that the Bible was written in a particular context and historical circumstances. Much of the fundamentalist scholarship and apologetics often attempts to engage and explain away data rather than accepting it, understanding it, and incorporating it. I'm not saying that we should simply accept everything or anything that someone with a PhD after their name says. Rather, we should look carefully at the evidence presented and think through it and see if it aligns with the reality of Revelation. I've learned a great deal from both Dr. White and Dr. Heiser, but this is one of those times where I believe that Dr. White's response is less than helpful and often assumes what needs to be proven. Well, that's all for this episode of the BLOGCAST. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to smash that like button. If you found it interesting, please share it with your friends. And if you aren't already subscribed, then please be sure to hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to ring that notification bell so you'll know when new content is available. Don't forget, you can follow me on X and Instagram at Triggerman1976, links to which are in the link tree in the description, where you will also find links to my blogs, including the fuller version of this post, complete with references and additional sources. While there, be sure to browse through the affiliate store where you can pick up a copy of either my debut action thriller, Turning of Shadow, or my extended essay, Creationist Creed, or any of the resources that I use and recommend, like Peter Schaeffer's Two Gods in Heaven, which explores the relationship between intertestamental sources and the identity of Christ in later Christian thought. Purchase from the store help me to create content and help you find great deals. Again, thanks for watching. Until the next time, friends, God bless.